What is up, guys? Jay Diesel here. I am back for my final build update of the League for my Shield Crush character. I'm really happy with how this character came together. It easily downs all the Uber bosses. We are holding our own down at 1400 depth and delve. We've managed to do all types of mapping strategies, and overall the character feels really good. I am extremely happy with how this character has come together. And I wanted to go ahead and kind of touch on the gear changes that I've made, the skill tree changes that I've made, and talk about the mercenary as well, because a lot has happened since my last update on week 1. So jumping right ahead into the gear here, we are still rocking a replica Dream Feather. We are fundamentally an armor stacking character. This is a massive source of damage for us. The only rolls that matter on this item are the flat armor and the corrupted 20% increased area of effect. Everything else is kind of secondary. You don't really need it. Even the flat armor is just a tiny bit of extra damage, but you might as well get it while you're at it. Jumping over to the shield, we're using an Emperor's Vigilance. You really can't do better than this. If you want to get one with high quality, rather than paying for one on the marketplace, you can go ahead instead buy a steel kite shield instead. This is the only thing that it can be chanced into. So if you go ahead, buy yourself an Omen of Fortune, you can influence it however you want, and then transform it into an Emperor's Vigilance for your best in slot shield. Jumping over to the helmet, this was actually one place where there's been some pretty big changes since my last video. In my last video, I wasn't running the nearby enemies take 1% increased damage per 2 fortification on you. This is a really powerful mod that only comes from the infamous mercenaries. To get a helmet that's craftable, you're going to need to buy one of these helmets and either fracture it yourself or buy one that's already fractured. This will allow you to get up to 20% increased phys damage, given that at all points in time we are hovering at 40 fortification. We can get up to 47 activating our focus off of our body armor, but most of the time you're going to be around 40, so this is just 20% increased phys damage. As for the rest of the mods on the helmet, you need to have an int roll somewhere in this build in order to meet all your requirements. I chose to do it on the helmet. Additionally, the increased mana reservation efficiency of skills is really nice. This allows us to squeeze in all of our auras. Additionally, by getting it here, we don't have to get it on the body armor, which makes the body armor a lot easier to craft. And as for prefixes, we're going to have +2 to the level of socketed AoE gems. This is somewhat important because in our helmet, we actually have a Purity of Fire here. Getting that additional +1 level versus crafting +1 to AoE gems gets us 1% additional max fire res, which is going to be really important because ultimately we are a Melding of the Flesh build now, and we have 90 all res. So without this +2, this is actually going to be at 89%, and you're going to have to spend a point somewhere else on the tree in order to gain 1 max fire res. As for implicits, you're just going to have 12% increased mana reservation. This, once again, our mana is a little bit tight in this build. There are some other things that you can do if you need additional mana reservation. And reduce cost of attacks to just make our mapping buttery smooth. Jumping over to the amulet, it's still a replica Dragon Fang's Flight. You're not going to do better than +3 level of Shield Crush gems. We have a breakpoint at 24. So if you choose not to run this, then you would need to run something. Potentially, you could run like a Ulnatol's Vow if you want to run it in Power. That's kind of an option that I've thought about, but it ultimately ends up being less damage. You also don't get the mana reservation efficiency, which is pretty useful here. Other options you have are if you want to do like a +3 chest. I know in the past, when I've done other versions of this build, I've run like a Brass Dome. If you get like a +3 Brass Dome, you could do that. There's a couple different options that you could explore, but ultimately this is the one I'm happiest with. As for our chest, you can see that we changed out our Royal Plate for a Conquest Lamellar. Reason for this is that we ultimately went Iron Reflexes on our tree here. And by going Iron Reflexes, this allowed us to go ahead and convert all the evasion here and here into additional armor. This does mean that we had to change out our Lethal Pride because we needed access to that keystone again. I'll get into that in a little bit. But ultimately, massive armor evasion chest, increased effect of non-curse auras is going to be your most powerful implicit on this. And then determination effect is also nice. As for suffixes, you're just going to do, 2 reses and max fort while focused. This ends up being a pretty big DPS cooldown for us. If you take a look, whenever we focus, not only is this going to increase our attacks per second, but this is also going to go ahead and increase our armor as well. So this ends up being a pretty big difference here. So you can see we go up to 4.7 attacks per second. Jumping down to the gloves, we're running the Celestial Brace. This is just for plus 10 to max fortification. As a champion, we are always at max fortification, so plus 10 does wonders. Additionally, 1% increase attack speed per fortification. We are at 44 at all the time. This goes up to 47. Really nice. As for the belt, it's a Mage Blood. You really can't go wrong with Mage Blood, especially when you're doing like an armor stacking build. This is a massive source of defenses and is a ton of damage. Additionally, I will say for this particular build, the dex roll on your Mage Blood does matter a little bit, as it's pretty important for trying to hit all the Rex on this build, especially if you're going to run a Conquest Lamellar. Because as you can see here, our dex actually doesn't hit 173. We're kind of cheesing our way there by using the 10% reduced attribute requirements on our neck to actually be able to wear this. Boots. Boots, you're just going to run chance to avoid being shocked boots. If you don't want to use an Abyssal Socket, you can instead go ahead and do chance to avoid being shocked as one of your Eldritch Implicits to get up to 100%. We're going to be running a Storm Shroud for ailment immunity. We weren't doing this previously, but I found this to be better. This also allowed us to change our Pantheon. Previously we were running Brine King, but since then we've swapped over to Soul of Aracali. This is actually pretty nice, as damage over time is one of the few things that can really phase our build. And so this helps out quite a bit. Also, debuffs expiring faster is quite nice as well. And last but not least is our rings. These are just massive Chaos Res rings. So you can actually see if we take off our 2 rings here and we take a look, we are at minus 22% Chaos Res. We slap both these on and we're capped. So these are just big Chaos Res rings with, you know, T1 life, T2 life. And additionally, I also got reduced reflected Fizz damage. This is kind of nice because this allows me to just run reflect maps without changing out a flask. As for your last flask slot, with your Mage Blood, you have a couple of options. You can either choose Progenesis. This is what I tend to default to most of the time. It just feels very comfy and nice. And especially when you're running harder content, especially like Deep Delve, this can save your life in a lot of situations. Or if you're just mapping, doing some easier stuff, you just kind of want to, you know, chill. Wine of the Prophet is also pretty fun. You can just kind of toss it on. You do have to think about what buffs you're getting on it, and you do need to cycle through the cards, but it's still pretty fun to use. As for your utility flasks here, Basalt Flask, this is just increased armor, ton of damage. Diamond Flask, Curse Immunity, along with a bunch of crit strike chance. Ruby Flask, this is going to help us maintain that 90 all res here because we're capping off our fire. And last but not least, a Silver Flask, so that we can have permanent onslaught and regenerate a bunch of health. So now that we've gone over my gear, almost equally important is actually going to be our Kineticist gear. So ultimately, I decided to go with a Kineticist, reason being, haste is really nice. It's a lot of attack speed, movement speed, it makes map clearing feel a lot better. The gear setup that I went for with the Kineticist is as follows. So I actually went with a pair of Asenaths with vulnerability and enfeeble. So this means that we're actually going to have a pretty high curse limit in order to be able to go ahead and have not only vulnerability, enfeeble, and temp chains up, but also to be able to make sure we aren't overriding our Assassin's Mark. So as a result, we're going to have to go ahead and make sure there's at least a curse limit of 4 on our Mercenary. The way that I opted to accomplish this was through 2 Dodre's Damnings and a Perkwill's Toe with additional curse. If you don't want to run a Perkwill's Toe with additional curse, this can be fairly pricey. You can also go ahead and you can choose to anoint Whispers of Doom to get an additional curse here if you really want to. I really enjoy Last Rites personally. Just having, 50% reduced life regeneration rate on enemies is a pretty big deal. As for the belt, we're just going to run an Immortal Flesh. Once you slap this on your character, the amount of regeneration is going to make it very hard for them to fall on the floor. And you're going to really enjoy having this on here because ultimately, while you have all these cool buffs on your Merc, if your Merc falls on the floor, then all you've done is make the enemies harder. And by giving them more health, then you're not really getting anything for it. The boots here are just going to be double T1 res, movement speed, chance to avoid being chilled or frozen. with some action speed for additional attack speed and movement speed, along with more life regeneration rate. As for the chest, I opted for a Garb of the Ephemeral. This is actually where we're getting our crit immunity on our character. So rather than speccing into something like the Determination's Watcher's Eye and maybe a crit mastery, we're going to opt to have a Garb here. This also prevents you from being stunned or frozen or whatever else. It's actually a very nice piece to have. The Purple's Toe here, lucky damage is pretty nice on our character. It's just an extra damage boost out of the next slot, which is cool. We're running a Victorio's Charity, so I'll talk about this in a little bit as this ties into our tree. But one nice thing about this is that they get a Frenzy Charge to nearby allies on hit. This can actually help with Frenzy Charge generation on our character and actually save us a bunch of passive points, which is really nice. As for the helmet, this is probably one of the more unique things on my Mercenary, where I went for one of the Corrupted Vol masks, one with Malediction. Malediction is nearby enemies deal 10% less damage and have 10% increased damage taken. This is actually a really nice buff to have. Additionally, I also managed to get one where nearby enemies also take 9% increased physical damage, so this is a massive source of damage for our character as well. Finally, the weapon, I just crafted a, T1 Fractured Essence Lightning Damage Attack Speed wand just so she can start blasting. She actually does like a pretty respectable amount of damage and pretty consistently inflicts both shock and chill, especially in lower tier content like tier 16, tier 16.5, even sometimes on bosses she can manage to actually add some more ailments in. So overall, Mercenary is very cool, very happy about him. Let's go ahead and jump over to our tree here. Alright, so let's go ahead and jump into the passive tree here. So some initial changes, I went ahead and picked up Unwavering Stance. This is because I dropped the Brine King. We also were able to get out of all of these points over here. This is because I was actually able to min-max in other places in order to get enough max fire res that I was able to save these points and put them into other things, which I was very happy about. This is going to be your Seething Fury over here. This is just absolutely mandatory if you're going to do any type of crit-based Shield Crush build or, Spectral Shield Throw, etc. This is just a massive amount of both crit chance and crit multi as well. So jumping down here, one big change you're going to see is I've added a Light of Meaning to the build, but I've also gone ahead and moved my Lethal Pride over here to this jewel socket instead because I wanted access to Iron Reflexes. So being able to access Iron Reflexes allowed us to go ahead and go for a much higher effective armor chest here using the Conquest Lamellar, as well as get some value out of our helmet, because remember, this infamous mod only drops on armor evasion helmets, so I figured might as well get some value out of that as well. So we picked up Iron Reflexes here. Our Light of Meaning has 14% chance to ignore enemy physical damage reduction. I do recommend having this on at least one jewel. You can also go ahead and spec points into this if you want to pick this up as well. This just makes your mapping a lot smoother. Occasionally you'll get altars that are just like a ton of armor or PDR on some random enemy, and this just kind of smooths out your damage. Additionally, over here we also picked up Versatile Combatant. Previously, we were running Tempest Shield in order to cap our spell block and to give us immunity to shock. But after picking up our Storm Shroud here and crafting boots in order to be able to become, 100% chance to avoid shock, I decided Tempest Shield wasn't worth it anymore, so I went ahead, dropped that. That made it easier to go ahead and get in our Purity of Fire here. And I decided to pick up Versatile Combatant because that does get us up to 65-65. And losing that 10% max isn't nearly as bad as it would normally be because, well, we're glancing blows anyway. We still take damage when we block, and the character is already tanky enough that that 10% is not going to move the needle too much. As for other interesting nodes over here, this is an absolute metric ton of regen. This functionally reads every 4 seconds. You just go back to full health, which is really nice. Adamant, this little wheel here I think is actually pretty underrated. Guard skills have 20% increased cooldown recovery is pretty massive. This is 40% cooldown recovery on our guard skill. We actually have our Molten Shell in an automation setup. It's only got a 2.84 second cooldown. And additionally, whenever we use a guard skill, we go ahead and clear all those nasty bleeds off of us, which is pretty nice. Jumping over this way, we ended up going with basically the same cluster jewel we had last time. Only difference, we picked up 3% increased attack speed, and I synthesized on Chaos Res. Veteran Defender and Fuel to Fight are going to be the two nodes you really want to have. The attributes and Ellie Res off this are both relevant, along with the 60% increased defenses. And Fuel to Fight is going to be your source of Mana Leech for this build, which combines very nicely with our instant Mana Leech that we're picking up over here. As for the jewels, we already talked about Storm Shroud. This is also where we picked up Melding of the Flesh. We decided to go 90 all res. If you don't know, Melding of the Flesh decides to cap your max elemental reses based on your highest. So even with this -4 here, through a combination of our Ruby Flask and our Purity of Fire, we still managed to have 90 all res, which functionally gives us 90 all res all around, which is very nice. Jumping up to Inexorable here, this is actually how we generate our endurance charges. We go ahead and just manage to get, endurance charges when we're hit, which is cool. Additionally, this is going to be our Lethal Pride. This Lethal Pride is very nice for us. We're actually getting 4 max fortification, along with this 5% chance to deal double damage, and even 1% life regen, so I'm very happy with it. Jumping over here, this was another addition that I made. After making this swap, I realized that I wasn't getting Rage on hit anymore out of my Lethal Pride setup, like I was over here. And it was going to be a lot of extra damage to pick up this 10 max Rage. So I grabbed these two. This gives me more consistent Rage generation than I had previously. 10 max Rage, and, you take this. This point is negligible, but a little bit of extra movement speed never hurts. Here, I've opted for a Voices. Previously, I had actually gone and run a 5 passive Voices. That costs an additional 2 passive points over this, but I wanted it so that way I could allocate Flesh and Flame on Headsman. This is the 20% call from Slayer. It feels really, really good. You'll love it for bossing. You'll love it for mapping. A little bit of movement speed is also cool after you kill something and decide to map around. And finally, I picked up a triple Pride Watcher's Eye. You don't need a triple mod Watcher's Eye. You can very easily get a 25% chance to impale, and impales inflict last 2 additional hits. That is perfectly serviceable. I was using that one for a really long time. I upgraded to a triple because it was available and wasn't too expensive, so I decided to pick that up. So one other thing I'll talk about real quick are the rune graphs that I'm opting to use. So this is the rune graph of the warp. Buffs expire slower, debuffs expire faster. This one is incredibly strong, but it's very innocuous. I really, really like this one specifically because the increasing buffs, this affects shrines. So this means if you have any sort of mapping strategy where you have supplementary shrines just to improve clear speed, those are going to last 30% longer. Or if you're doing something like the Alpha strat with an evolving shrine, that lasts 30% longer. Debuffs expiring faster is really nice for dealing with things like Wither. Wither tends to stack up, you take a ton of extra chaos damage and whatever. This causes those individual stacks to fall off faster, reducing how hard you're actually getting hit by that chaos damage. So that one is actually very nice. I really like it. This one is very forgettable. I just have an extra point here. Maybe I'll do something with it later. And Runecraft of the Sinestral is incredibly good. 10% more attack speed with offhands. I would absolutely tat this on as fast as possible. Speaking of tattoos, we are running one tattoo. It is for the Tassila Warrior. This is a 5% chance to blind. If you take a look at our accuracy, I know this looks a little scary. You'll blind enemies pretty consistently. You're attacking a ton. And then if you remember, if you go ahead and look at our Ascendancy, we taunt enemies on hit. This is just guaranteed unless they are taunt immune. You do 15% more damage to them, and this fixes our accuracy problem. It's also nice against evasive monsters and the like. But yeah, overall, that is going to kind of cover our tree here. You can also see in terms of Ascendancy, we have Fortitude, 3% more armor and evasion rating per fort, above 20. We're rocking 40 fort, goes all the way up to 47 when we focus. And Inspirational, this is just 30% increased non-cursor effect, which is pretty nice. You also get additional damage when you drop a banner. I'm going to go ahead and hop over to the PoB real quick, talk a little bit about some of the settings in the config. Obviously, people do plenty of magic tricks in this section in order to make their character look better or worse, whatever. In my case, I tend to try to keep things fairly conservative in a lot of cases. Arakaali, Tukahama, time spent stationary 1. If you're DPSing with this build, you are in fact standing still. So that is going to be one thing to keep in mind about the build. As for your life regen calculation, the reason this is on minimum is if you put it on average, this number looks insane. It looks like we're regenning over half our health bar a second. However, that is simply because this node exists. And this happens every 4 seconds. You kind of regen your whole health bar. That can be wasted if the damage is like at the wrong time. So I choose to just go off minimum. But just know that every 4 seconds, you're basically healing to full. You use power charges off Assassin's Mark, frenzy charges. This is just going to be off your mercenary and blood rage. Endurance charges, you just get that from being hit. You have onslaught, you are fortified. I choose 20 rage. You actually have a max rage of 40 in this build, and you're going to sustain it most of the time when you're mapping. I elect just to use 20. I think this is a little bit fairer in like a boss context, where maybe you only get a couple seconds for DPSing. You're gaining 2 rages per tick. And I think 40 is a little much. But in a mapping scenario, you're absolutely going to have 40 the majority of the time as you go between packs. Leeching, Flask active. Pride, this is typically going to be max effect. You can say that it's like initial if you just roll up. But most of the time it's going to be max effect on anything that you actually need max effect for. Such as like Uber bosses or whatever. They'll typically live longer than 4 seconds. As for your stance, you're going to be in blood stance most of the time if you want to do a ton of damage. If you're just mapping and you want the AoE, a little more comfy, I swap between them. Sometimes if the content I'm doing is not especially challenging or a little bit easier and this is just going to be sufficient damage, I'll just sit in stand stance and I'll just use the AoE to clean up a little cleaner. Most of the time you're going to be right on top of the enemy, but let's say you're a little further away, maybe you're in sand stance. Those enemies are still getting absolutely blasted, so that's totally fine. Most of the time, the enemy's going to be blinded. This is really only relevant, the blind portion here. When you're dealing with an enemy that can't be taunted, this blind could actually come in clutch and get you up to about 98% accuracy, 99, which is just good enough for our intents and purposes. As for the enemy being intimidated and crushed, this actually comes off our Awoke gems. The enemy is also, in a lot of cases, technically shocked or chilled just from our mercenary, but I'm not going to bother factoring that in. We're just going to say, that's extra. Here, though, some of these custom mods on the side here, these come off our mercenary. This is Malediction. This is Perkle's Toe. This is Vulnerability. And this is the Elder mod on the helmet. Here we can go ahead and swap it over to Uber Pinnacle. As you can see, we're still doing, 68, almost 69 million damage. Nice. Which is pretty respectable. This is enough damage where you're going to manage to down every single Uber boss comfortably as long as you play the fights correctly. You are not going to be able to invalidate the fights compared to something like a Miner where you can skip all the phases and everything like that. You will probably have to do a Meatball Madness minute or the like. But you're tanky enough where you shouldn't just fall over, and as long as you play the fights reasonably well, it really shouldn't be that big a deal for you. You can also go ahead over here if you want to just see our initial damage, ignore the Pride effect. Even with the initial effect, we're still hitting for 53. And if you want to see your max damage against Ubers, you can go ahead, you stand still for 5 seconds, you throw up a focus, even throw up your banner, and look at that, 95 million Uber damage. Obviously, that's like best case scenario, and like if you want to crank up your rage, you want to really pad the stats, right? But that's not really what I'm here for. Most of the time, you're going to be hitting for something a little bit more conservative. Obviously, even there, you're still managing to hit for 68 million damage, so you shouldn't be sweating too hard. Let's go ahead and talk a little bit about some of the defensive things on this character. Here, take a look at our max hit. Our EHP is fairly good. There are definitely tankier characters out there, but I think this character has reached an acceptable level of tank for the majority of content in the game. You have really good Ellie max hit. If you go to our Molten Shell here, Molten Shell is going to be ticked most of the time. When it's off, we're still respectively tanky. This is going to have fairly high uptime most of the time, simply because we have this. It's going to be up. Also, you only need a low-level Molten Shell because our armor is so high. You're going to get the max effect majority of the time anyway. Also worth noting, when you take a look at the skills, you can turn off Molten Shell here. This is assuming Progenesis is not even on. So if you slap a Progenesis on top of that, which is going to run most of the time, especially in any sort of like mapping type scenario, turn your Molten Shell on. Well, now you're extremely tanky, right? You're not going to fall over to basically anything. And also remember, in the background, we have plenty of regen ticking, keeping our health pool nice and topped up. And we also take 20% less damage over time between the Aracali Pantheon and from the Fortification Mastery over here. One more thing I would go ahead and take a look at is actually the skills section here. So we're going to be running Shield Crush. I have a 21-23. You don't need that. You do need this to be at least level 21. That way your replica Dragon Fang's Flight can get you the level 24 breakpoint. You can even see here on the amulet, this is giving us 25% increased damage. This is a very, very big deal. Awaken Multi-Strike. If you can't get Awaken Multi-Strike, use regular Multi-Strike. Pulverize is really nice. This is a lot of increased area of effect and more damage. Impale. This is just we're an Impale-based build. Brutality. This allows you to crush on hit. Ton of extra damage. And Awaken Melee Fizz. We also have a Bark on Hit setup. You don't need Life Tap. You actually are able to sustain this just fine, as long as you have the proper mana reservation efficiency. You could always put a Life Tap in if you want to drop something else. We run Blood and Sand. This is just going to be one of your stance skills. Extra AoE is really, really nice, especially when you are just doing some easier mapping. We do have an automation setup here. It's going to be automating Blood Rage, Phase Run, and Molten Shell. What I will say about this is you don't have to use Phase Run. I opt to use Phase Run because I do a lot of delving, and I do have a Phase Run setup in my offhand as well. But sometimes I just want to run between two short nodes, so I have this in here. If you don't want Phase Run, you can remove it. You can do like an increased duration or any other number of things. Put a second Enlighten in if you have problems with mana reservation or whatever. This doesn't have to be here. The rest of this is cool. Shield Charged is just linked to faster attacks. I like going really fast. I play a lot of vertical layouts that don't have a lot of ledges and things like that. So Shield Charge is my preferred way to get around. This actually does like a reasonable amount of damage as well. So sometimes you kill stuff with it. War Banner is going to be our preferred banner. This is actually just really nice for more fizz damage. Slap it down, use like a DPS cooldown. It's pretty nice. Our helmet is going to be Pride, Purity of Fire, Determination, and Enlighten. It is important that your Purity of Fire is in your helmet because that's where the +2 AoE is, which allows you to get this extra level. It is worth noting that if you were to decrease the level of this Purity of Fire, that suddenly you're losing 2 max fire res. So make sure this is in your helmet. Make sure you have a +2 helmet. It'll help a lot. We have a Precision attached to Arrogance. Mana's already pretty tight. This is a ton of accuracy and crit strike chance. We love that. And finally, you have a Flesh and Stone. This is a ton of extra damage, or it makes you a little bit chunkier if you need that instead. But that kind of covers all of the skills here. So all in all, a fairly tanky character. You do tons and tons of damage. No smoke and mirrors here. You're 90 all res, 65-65. Block spell cap. Remember, this is glancing blows. You do take damage when you block. You're fairly fast. You're not the fastest character under the sun, but you're fairly fast. And yeah, overall, that kind of sums up the character. I've been exceedingly happy with the character this league. It clears all content. I feel very comfortable saying that. There's no content in the game where I'm just like, wow, there's no way for me to do that. I ran plenty of Valdo's boxes as well. For, Savior, Emperor's Mastery, tons of different jewels and whatever. Made a lot of money out of Valdo's boxes this league, deep delving, some money out of Uber bossing, all types of things. You really are able to run anything. If I were to give any type of maybe don't run this content, I would maybe say like Breach or Legion. Those are going to be only so-so. You have an Asnath's, which does give you the pops, but your character isn't running a Headhunter or an Inspired Learning or anything like that, so it's not going to be as good as those types of characters for that content. You also aren't a range skill, so I would recommend trying to focus on things where you can leverage the fact that A, you're extremely tanky, and B, you do a ton of damage. But overall, I've really enjoyed this character. I've had a really, really good time this league, and honestly, I am very, very happy. But thank you so much for joining me. If you made it to this part of the video, I really appreciate it. If you want to learn more about the build, you can always drop a comment. I'm happy to answer questions. Be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and all of that. But I have been Jay Diesel. Thank you so much for tuning in. you know, may all your drops be blessed. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll talk to you guys later. Peace.